The government has been forced to talk about climate change, so it's taking a subtle and sinister approach, by Greg Jericho from The Guardian. With its old ideology being treated with universal scorn, a new line is being embraced, and it could signal the death of the planet. The impact of climate change over the past 5 months across Australia has caused climate change deniers within the media and governments to quickly update their tactics to a new sinister position. Gone are the plans to just keep lying for the next decade that activists such as Greta Thunberg are predicting that the world is going to end in 2030, or to continue to flub and fudge the science. No real warming since 1998, 2005, 2010, 2016. Solar activity, volcanoes, Greenland. Now, of course, the feculent minds of columnists and government MPs will continue to spout these lies. When has reality ever been an impediment to their effluent-driven utterances? But the months of fire across southern Queensland, northern New South Wales, the horrors of Gippsland, the New South Wales South Coast and Kangaroo Island over Christmas and New Year, the smoke haze across Sydney and Canberra, and now Melbourne, has shifted towards their timetable of obfuscation. 5 months ago, they could still get away with wheeling out the, quote, "now is not the time," end quote, line, or to confidently state that you cannot link this bushfire to climate change. But now such lines are greeted with universal scorn. Last year was the hottest and driest calendar year in Australia's recorded history. That created the conditions for the fires, and they do not exist without climate change. At this point, any climate change denier with access to a social media account will tell you that rainfall has actually increased over the past century in Australia. This is true, and is also utterly irrelevant and designed to mislead. Climate change impacts have only really taken off since the late 1960s and early 70s, and not surprisingly, given the size and differing climates of Australia, the impact on rainfall has varied. Over the past 50 years, the trend rate of rainfall in northern Australia has barely changed. If anything, it has risen a bit. Great if you like rain and you live in Broome. But in southeastern Australia, the trend is clearly falling. Now that they are unable to say, quote, "now is not the time," end quote, they have adapted. Rather than suggest no connection with climate change, they have shifted to arguing there is no connection between any particular climate change policy and bushfires. Scott Morrison argued last week on ABC's 7:30, quote, "you cannot link any individual single emission reduction policy of a country, whether it's Australia or anyone else, to any specific fire event. I mean, that's just absurd," end quote. Yes, it is absurd, because no one is actually arguing that. But the Prime Minister is very good at defeating arguments no one is making. He is also very good at giving false hope. Right now, columnists and journalists are writing articles expressing belief that maybe Morrison is about to shift the government's climate change policy. Perhaps he will, but I have seen Charlie Brown try to kick this football before, and I remain unpersuaded because I have listened to what the Prime Minister himself has said just this past week. 3 times David Spears, from The Insiders, asked him on Sunday if the government would increase its emissions target. Morrison responded with, quote, "well, the Cabinet and the government will continue to evolve our policies," end quote. Then he added, "what I'm saying is I'm not going to put someone's job at risk, a region's, town's future at risk," end quote. And finally, quote, "what I'm saying is we want to reduce emissions and do the best job we possibly can and get better and better and better at it," end quote. I wonder if you've seen that graffiti on the side of that huge smokestack in Melbourne, "no jobs on a dead planet." What he is saying is, quote, "no," end quote. Nothing he has said suggests any change in policy that will actually involve emissions reductions. Instead, he has quickly adopted the new go-to response of climate change deniers, that of the need to adapt and, quote, "improve resilience," end quote. And just before I continue note that he's probably not, this author is probably not going to mention animal agriculture, which is a major driver of the climate crisis and also something that Australia can't seem to let go of because we've got this ridiculous nostalgia, and also we're making a lot of money from live export and also just the and exporting here and there. So that's not going to be mentioned anywhere in anybody's any of these particular authors when they're talking about the climate crisis in Australia, unfortunately. What does this mean? It means the next step in climate change denial, a step I joked grimly last month, was not far away. Alas, it is no longer a joke. The new argument is that, yes, climate change is probably to blame, but we can't do anything about it, and anyway, it's too late now, so let's, quote, adapt, end quote. Before I go on, this is something interesting too, that the Trump administration, of course all administrations in the United States have been problematic on addressing this issue, but the Trump administration actually released something a few months ago that what's the point? This is actually a public document, I think. What is the point in addressing emissions when it's too late, so there's no point in actually addressing emissions? So this is sort of like, I think Morrison is almost taking a leaf out of the Trump administration's book. And what does that adaptation involve? According to Morrison, quote, building dams is key to that, native vegetation management is key to that, land clearing is key to that, end quote. In other words, doing the very things conservatives have been desirous of for the past century, building dams, reducing national parks, and increasing land clearing. They will hand out grants to organisations in areas most electorally beneficial, and all the while trumpet that they are dealing with the issue in a practical way, unlike the opposition which they argue will be trying to kill jobs. Conservatives hate dealing with the actual source of problems. They much prefer handing out the graft, which is appropriate when you realise climate change denialism is the biggest con in political and media history. And of course, emissions will rise while they suggest they are actually being reduced. The line from Morrison is that we will, quote, meet and beat, end quote, our Paris emissions reductions targets. The current figures from his own government show that rather than reduce emissions in 2030 by 26% below 2005 levels, we are on track to cut them by just 16%. But the real problem, one that needs much more attention than interviewers now give it, is the 26% target itself has no basis in science as being anywhere near enough to keep temperatures below 1.5 Celsius. Now this elusive, by the way, just going off here for a moment, this elusive 1.5, there's already, according to one scientist, 3 degrees is already baked in. I'm just going to digress for a second and just, I meant to say over 3 degrees Celsius, but there was this article, oblique UN climate report, world on track for up to 3.9 degrees warming by the end of the century. This is November, late November this article was written. The summary findings are bleak, the report states, as safer levels of warming require immediate and substantial cuts, which are likely in the current political and economic climates of the two biggest emitters, the United States and China, which boosted emissions by 4.7% last year. Quote, every year of delay beyond 2020 brings a need for faster cuts, which become increasingly expensive, unlikely and impractical. Delays will also quickly put the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal out of reach, end quote. Even if all the countries that signed the 2015 agreement cut emissions according to its Parisian goals, the UN report released Tuesday estimates that global temperatures would still rise 3.2 degrees Celsius. With the effects of a hotter, more chaotic planet already in motion, with just 1 degree of warming baked in, close to 4 degrees would bring a world drastically altered from our own. So, and I would say that's actually being optimistic, that it actually would be much more than almost 4 degrees. It would be probably more like 6 degrees Celsius. 3 degrees Celsius, that's already baked in right now. So I don't know, this sort of ridiculous delusional 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's or that's not possible anymore. It's going to go beyond that. Anyway, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported in 2018 that to keep global temperatures from rising above 1.5 Celsius, CO2 emissions needed to, quote, decline by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050, end quote. Now, you see, that particular target is absolutely useless, really, because that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a very conservative organization, and I mean, it needed to be net zero around 2000 or before, actually. So, you know, these sort of poor sort of targets are just, they're delusional if they think that they're actually going to. Really, it's going to be sort of way too late. But anyway, 45%, not 26%, and that is a 45% reduction of actual emissions, not including farcical, quote, land use, end quote, figures. When we include land use, our 26% target really becomes closer to 15%. Morrison boasting that Australia will meet and beat its target is like someone boasting that they are beating their target of 10 minutes of exercise a day and hoping everyone ignores the doctor's recommendation of 30 minutes. A 45% cut of real emissions is well below what the government is targeting and miles below our current projections. I'll let you have a look at these graphs. I'll leave a link to this essay in the information section. The reality is, even while including land use, we are still well short of where we need to be. See, there's absolutely no mention of animal agriculture there. It's truly astonishing. I mean, there's agriculture, but what is that? Anyway. And so we enter the next stage of climate change politics. A subtle and sinister shift. The talk will be about practical measures of adaptation rather than of reducing emissions. Gone will be direct action. In its place will be, quote, direct adaptation, end quote. It is a stage that, if successful, will signal the end for our planet. Greg Jericho writes on economics for The Guardian, Australia. And by the way, this isn't an endorsement of Greg Jericho or The Guardian. So anyway, that's an interesting essay, and I actually think that's probably true, that Scott Morrison is going to do that adaptation thing, and he sees that he is an end-of-days believer. He's an evangelical Christian, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, and so he would probably think that what's happening now is the will of God. He wouldn't say that out loud, but that's probably what he thinks. And he sees the burning down of, like 2 million acres of forest, of Australian bushland. He sees that as, was it 2 million acres? Yeah, I think that's how much it is. He sees that as a business opportunity. So he doesn't have to worry about those pesky billion with a B, animals that have been burnt alive. All kinds of animals. He doesn't, he probably cares about the animals that have been burnt in the paddocks because that's a property loss. Sadly, this is how, because we're a non-vegan society, basically speaking, he would see that as property loss. And there's been thousands, possibly millions actually, of, depending on how far the fires have gone in recent times, but at least thousands and thousands and thousands of cows and sheep and other animals and chickens and all of that burnt alive in paddocks, because they cannot escape, because we're not vegan and that's why they're there. And chickens being burnt alive in cages. So that's sort of how it is. And I would agree with Greg Jericho that the Prime Minister, because he is an end-of-days believer as well, and Conservatives, all they're interested in business opportunities and telling the public that they're going to create jobs. And as I said, there's no jobs on a dead planet, but they have no vision. They have these short-term ideas of how they can improve their career prospects in the future after they leave politics. So they make deals with all their corporate mates, and they have the Murdoch press behind them. And I've recently done something about how the Murdoch press has been trying to direct the narrative about the climate crisis and making out like it's arsonists. And there's paid trolls running around on Twitter trying to change the narrative away from the climate crisis and towards arsonists and other things and lack of backburning and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, it's kind of dire, but this is sort of an indication of really a lot of governments today anyway, the Trump administration, who will possibly get in again in 2020 because there is no real alternative to Trump. The Democratic Party does not present itself as a real alternative. And so, and they've messed it up with pushing Russiagate for ages, and now this focusing on Ukraine gate instead of, there's so many things they could have impeached him on, like the genocide in Yemen and all that kind of thing, but they don't really care in many ways if Trump gets back in, because they have no real interest in really addressing climate change either, or in any other social inequality. So, you know, I'm sorry to sound pessimistic, but this is sort of where we are now, facing imminent extinction and taking most of the planet with us. I remember a few years ago reading Chris Hedges, he's a Pulitzer Prize recipient, reading his essay, This Time We're Taking the Whole Planet With Us. And he talks about what happened on Easter Island and how they had sort of like a class system on Easter Island once. And eventually they sort of went through all the resources on Easter Island, and until they basically ended up eating the dogs that they had as pets, you know, pets in quotes. And that's similar to what's happening here right now. They basically, you know, created their own sort of disaster and their own sort of decline on Easter Island, and we're kind of, in some ways, that's on a micro scale, but on a macro scale, this is what we're doing here. We've eating through everything, refusing to give up animal agriculture because of our taste pleasure. It's got nothing to do with actually surviving. You know, it's just all, and, you know, sort of refusing to give up fossil fuels because the oligarchy doesn't want to give up fossil fuels, and they're going to force us to keep using them. And there's not much alternative in sort of vision. You know, coal and everything. I mean, you know, it's just sort of, you know, we've ended up with an oligarchy, and they're driving us headlong over a cliff. And half the car is over the cliff right now, and it just needs a little headwind to push it, and there we go. So sorry to sound pessimistic, but I mean, this has been something I've been aware of since at least 2013, with the, you know, the Arctic sort of melting, with the methane rising from the oceans and also from the East Siberian Arctic shelf, and all the other things that are happening, insects dying off. I mean, there's so many things. It's really hard to keep up with the decline. Basically, the ecocide is coming. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that you will go vegan. If you've seen those memes that I regularly post about the incredible, the largest study to date which was published in the journal Science, 119 countries, 40,000 farms from farm to fork, 90% of all we eat. And the conclusion of that largest study to date, the scientific study, was that we need to adopt a plant-based diet. That's a diet free of eggs, dairy, and meat, and other animal products. And that would be the single biggest thing we could do to address the climate crisis, bigger than any other thing we could do, you know, not driving cars, not flying planes and all that kind of thing. And it's good for addressing the land shortages, the water shortages, and all of that kind of thing. So I implore you to go vegan, because you don't need any permission from anybody to go vegan. You can do that right now. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can be involved in nonviolent civil disobedience if you wish. But if you're not vegan, you're really not serious. I'm sorry to say that. I'm sorry to be so blunt. But at this point in the history of our species, which appears to be coming to an end very quickly, I think it's time for some real truths, some brutal facts, and also trying to encourage people not to be science deniers. And so, you know, it's true. I believe if people are wringing their hands about the climate crisis, and they're wringing their hands about the billions of animals dying in Australia, and the 70-meter flames and all that kind of thing. Imagine what it's going to be like in 5 years' time. But if people are wringing their hands about this, which a lot of people internationally are doing, and they're not vegan, and they know that the science about what animal agriculture is doing to the planet, then they're really not serious. Anyway, please subscribe if you haven't already. Click the notifications bell, otherwise you won't receive notifications when I drop a video. Thanks very much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. Till next time. Bye for now.